There was a machine in 1930s America so secret that the men trusted to use it had to swear an oath to defend it with their lives. It was carried to its aircraft under armed guard, locked in a safe between missions, and fitted with a small charge of thermite so that, if a bomber went down, the crew could burn the thing to molten slag before the enemy could lay hands on it. The government believed this device was one of the keys to winning the next war, a secret worth almost any price to protect. And while generals guarded it with pistols and oaths and incendiary charges, a quiet, balding draftsman walked into the very factory where it was built, day after day, studied its blueprints, carried the details home in his head, and reconstructed them for the intelligence service of a foreign power. By the time the first American bomb fell in anger, the enemy already had the secret. It had been mailed to Berlin years before. This is the story of the most jealously guarded invention of its age, the man who poured his life into building it, the spy who gave it away, and the strange, bitter truth that lay underneath all of it. Because the deepest secret of this machine was not the one the spy stole, it was that the machine never quite worked the way everyone believed. To understand why a bombsight could become the most protected object in the American arsenal, you have to understand the dream it was built to serve, and how close to impossible that dream really was. The dream was precision, the idea that you could send aircraft high above an enemy, and from there, drop bombs not on a city, not on a vague area, but on a specific factory, a specific bridge, a specific oil refinery, and destroy the enemy's ability to wage war while sparing everything around it. It was a beautiful idea, and it carried a moral promise as well as a military one. War from the air, the theorists argued, need not be the indiscriminate slaughter of the trenches. If you could hit precisely what you aimed at, you could cripple an enemy nation surgically, breaking its factories and leaving its people largely untouched, and perhaps win the whole war that way, without the years of mud and mass death the last one had brought. This was not a small or marginal idea. In the years between the wars, it became something close to a faith among the men building the American air arm. They believed that the bomber, striking by daylight, picking out and destroying the vital organs of an enemy economy, the ball-bearing plants, the oil refineries, the aircraft factories, could decide a war almost on its own. It was the whole justification for building great fleets of expensive bombers, the whole argument for an air force that could win independently rather than merely supporting armies and navies, and the entire faith rested on one fragile assumption, that you could actually hit the target. Take away precision, and the daylight bomber striking pinpoint targets becomes just another way of scattering explosives across a landscape. The bombsight was not a mere accessory to this faith, it was the foundation stone. Without a device that could hit the factory and miss the houses, the whole gleaming theory of clean, decisive surgical air war collapsed into something far uglier. That is why so much rode on a box of gears in the nose of an aircraft. But there was a problem at the heart of that dream, and the problem was simply the brutal physics of dropping an object from a great height while moving very fast. Picture a bomber 4 miles above the ground, flying at hundreds of feet per second. The crew wants to hit a building. The moment the bomb leaves the aircraft, it does not fall straight down. It carries forward with the speed of the aircraft, and it keeps carrying forward for miles, all the long seconds it takes to fall 4 miles to the earth. While it falls, the wind pushes it sideways. The aircraft's exact speed affects how far forward it travels. The altitude affects how long it falls and therefore how far the wind and the forward motion carry it. To put that bomb on a particular roof, you do not aim at the roof at all. You must release it miles short, at exactly the right instant, having calculated precisely how the bomb's forward motion, its long fall, and the sideways shove of the wind will combine to carry it to the target. Get any one of those numbers slightly wrong, and the bomb lands streets away or fields away. From 4 miles up, hitting a specific building with an unguided bomb is, by any ordinary reckoning, very nearly impossible. The early efforts proved it. Bombs scattered across the landscape. The dream of precision ran straight into the arithmetic of falling objects, and the arithmetic was winning. What was needed was a way to do that fearsome calculation perfectly in the few minutes of a bombing run, while the aircraft bucked, and the flak burst, and the target crawled slowly into view far below. And the man who became obsessed with solving it was an engineer unlike almost anyone else in the field. His name was Norden. He had been born in Europe, trained as an engineer, and he had come to America and made his life in the demanding world of precision machinery, much of it for the Navy. He was, by every account, a difficult and singular man, brilliant, exacting, secretive, contemptuous of sloppiness, and utterly consumed by his work. People who knew him called him, with a mixture of awe and exasperation, the old man. He had little patience for committees or publicity or the social graces of doing business with the military. He believed in the machine, in getting it exactly right, in the cold beauty of a mechanism that did precisely what the mathematics demanded and no less. There was something almost monastic about his devotion to precision. He would labour over a mechanism until it satisfied him completely, and no schedule or committee or impatient general could hurry him past his own standards. Where other men might accept a part that was nearly right, Norden saw nearly right as simply wrong, and he would rework it until it met the exacting tolerances in his head. He worked closely with a business partner who handled the dealings with the Navy and the Army that Norden himself found tiresome, leaving the old man free to do the thing he cared about, which was the engineering, and only the engineering. He had no interest in becoming a public figure, no hunger for the credit. While his device was being spoken of in hushed tones as a war-winning secret, its creator remained almost entirely unknown to the public. A private, demanding man bent over his drawings, indifferent to the legend gathering around his work. He distrusted fame and avoided it, to the point that the public knew almost nothing of him. Even as his device became legendary, he poured years of his life into the problem of the bombsight, refining it, perfecting it, treating it less as a product than as a kind of life's work, a mechanical answer to one of the hardest problems in the air. And what he built was, for its time, genuinely extraordinary. To grasp it, forget the word sight, because it suggests something far too simple. A pair of crosshairs you peer through. What Norden built was a mechanical computer, in an age before electronics, before anything we would recognize as a computer existed. He created a device of spinning gyroscopes, precision gears, levers, and an optical telescope, all working together to solve, continuously and automatically, the terrible equation of the falling bomb. Here is how it worked, in the terms that matter. The bombardier, lying over the sight in the nose of the aircraft, fed the machine the facts of the situation, the aircraft's speed, its altitude, the effect of the wind. He then peered through the telescope and placed its crosshairs on the target far below. And here is the clever heart of it. As the aircraft flew on, the target appeared to drift across the view, and the bombardier turned knobs to keep the crosshairs locked onto it. In doing so, he was unknowingly feeding the machine the last piece of information it needed, the true motion of the aircraft over the ground. Think for a moment about what that simple act of tracking accomplished. The hardest things to know in the whole problem were the aircraft's real speed across the ground, and the push of the wind, because the air itself is moving, and an aircraft does not travel over the earth quite the way its instruments suggest. But if the bombardier kept the crosshairs glued to a fixed point on the ground, then the rate at which he had to turn the knobs to hold them there was itself a perfect measure of how the aircraft was truly moving over the world below. The man chasing the target with the crosshairs was, without thinking about it, measuring the very quantities the calculation most needed. It was an elegant trick, turning the act of aiming into the act of measuring. The gyroscopes kept the whole apparatus steady and level, immune to the rocking of the aircraft, the way a spinning top resists being tipped over, so that the sight always knew which way was truly down regardless of how the bomber pitched and rolled. Picture a child's spinning top, how it stands upright and stubbornly resists your finger when you try to push it over. A spinning gyroscope does the same thing, holding its orientation against every jolt, and Norden used that stubbornness to give his sight a rock-steady sense of the vertical in a machine that was bucking through the sky. And with all of that information flowing in, the mechanical computer continuously calculated the exact point in space at which the bomb must be released to fall onto the target. It did not just tell the bombardier when to drop. In its fullest form, it was linked to the aircraft's autopilot, so that during the bombing run the sight itself flew the aircraft, making the tiny corrections needed to track straight toward the release point, steadier than any human hand. At the calculated instant, the machine released the bombs automatically. The bombardier had become, in effect, the operator of a precision instrument that did the impossible mathematics for him, and then steered the aircraft and dropped the load at the perfect moment. It is worth pausing to feel how remarkable that was. In an age of gears and springs, Norden had built a thing that sensed motion, held itself steady in 3 dimensions, solved a continuous calculation involving speed and height, and wind and time of fall, flew an aircraft, and released a weapon at exactly the right fraction of a second. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a computer made of brass and steel and spinning wheels, and the government, convinced it had in its hands the key to precision bombing, and therefore to winning a war cleanly, wrapped it in a level of secrecy bordering on the obsessive. Bombardiers swore a solemn oath to protect the site, to defend it with their lives if necessary, never to let it fall intact into enemy hands. It was carried to the aircraft under armed escort and locked away when not in use. It was fitted with that thermite charge so a downed crew could destroy it. To the men of the Army Air Forces, the sight was the crown jewel, the war-winning secret, the thing above all others that must never reach the enemy, and it reached the enemy years before the war through the simplest means imaginable, a man with a pencil and a good memory. His name was Hermann Lang. He was a German-born man who had come to America and found work at the very company that built the Bombsight, in a position that gave him access to its drawings. He was, on the surface, an unremarkable employee, quiet, competent, the kind of man who blends into a workshop. But Lang was loyal to the country of his birth, and he had made himself available to German intelligence. Through the late 1930s, he did something that no safe, and no armed guard, and no thermite charge could prevent. He studied the plans of the Bombsight at work, committed their details to memory, and reconstructed them at home, passing the reconstructed drawings to German agents who spirited them across the Atlantic. He did not have to steal a physical device past the guards. He carried the secret out in his head, a little at a time, and rebuilt it on his own kitchen table. The crown jewel of American military secrecy, the device protected by oaths and pistols and incendiary charges, walked out the door in the mind of a draftsman. He was part of a larger web of German agents operating in America in those years, a spy ring that gathered military and industrial secrets and fed them back to Germany. And the way that ring was broken is one of the great episodes of counter-espionage. Another man approached by German intelligence, a man they believed was working for them, was in fact cooperating with the American authorities, acting as a double agent. For many months, this double agent played his dangerous part, meeting the other spies, receiving their material, transmitting carefully controlled information back to Germany, all of it under the quiet observation of the authorities. A hidden camera recorded the agents as they came and went. A radio set, operated under supervision, fed the Germans a mixture of truth and falsehood while every contact was logged. Through that one-turned man, the entire shape of the ring was laid bare, its members, its methods, its messages, and when the trap was finally sprung, dozens of members of the ring were arrested and convicted, in what stood for a long time as the largest espionage conviction in American history. Lang was among those caught and convicted, but the conviction came after the fact. The damage, as far as the Bombsight was concerned, had already been done years earlier. The secret had crossed the ocean long before the cell was rolled up. Germany had the plans, and here is where the story turns and becomes stranger and more interesting than a simple tale of betrayal. Because the Germans, having received the secret of America's most guarded device, looked at it and largely shrugged. They already had bombsights of their own, good ones, suited to the kind of bombing they intended to do. They examined what they had been given, judged that it offered them little real advantage over their own equipment, and never made the great use of it that the frantic American secrecy would have led you to expect. The crown jewel, stolen at such risk and guarded at such cost, turned out to be something the enemy did not particularly need. The Germans had been handed the keys to the vault and they decided there was nothing inside worth taking. But the deepest irony is not even that. The deepest irony is what happened when the sight actually went to war in American hands, because the legend of the Bombsight, the story that grew up around it, held that it was so accurate a bombardier could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. That phrase, or something like it, captured the dream perfectly. And in the calm of a practice range, over a clear desert with no one shooting back, the sight could indeed be astonishingly accurate. But war is not a practice range. Over Europe, the reality was something else entirely. The bombers flew through thick cloud that hid the target completely, and you cannot put a bomb through a roof you cannot see. They flew through storms of anti-aircraft fire that made flying straight and level, exactly what the bombing run demanded. An invitation to death, and a bomber jinking to survive is a bomber that cannot aim. They flew while enemy fighters tore at their formations. The high winds at altitude, the haze, the smoke of earlier bombs drifting across the target, the sheer terror and chaos of combat, all of it degraded the beautiful precision of the machine, and there was a further twist that the secrecy itself created. Because there were never enough trained bombardiers who could truly master the sight, the air forces increasingly had whole formations drop their bombs on the signal of a single lead bombardier, so that the accuracy of dozens of aircraft came down to one man's aim and the discipline of the formation, scattering the load across a wide pattern rather than a single point. In practice, bombs fell not into pickle barrels, but scattered across wide areas, often hundreds of yards or more from the aiming point, sometimes missing the target by such margins that whole raids achieved little. The dream of surgical precision, of crippling an enemy's factories while sparing the streets around them, collided with the brutal facts of combat, and the facts won. Precision bombing in the real war turned out to be far less precise than the legend promised, and over time the bombing of Europe drifted, of grim necessity, toward hitting whole areas rather than single buildings, with all the consequences for the people below that the original dream had hoped to avoid. So consider the full shape of the thing. Here was a machine guarded as the war-winning secret, a device wrapped in oaths and armed escorts and thermite charges. It was betrayed years before the war by a draftsman who carried it out in his memory. The enemy who received it decided he did not need it, and when it finally went to war, it could not, in the chaos of real combat, deliver the miraculous precision that had justified all the secrecy in the first place. The most protected secret of its age was stolen, unwanted by the thief, and oversold to its own side, layer upon layer of irony, wrapped around a genuinely brilliant piece of engineering. Let me put you in the nose of one of those bombers, because the men who used the sight in combat were not living in the legend, they were living in the chaos. It is a freezing morning over Germany. You are the bombardier, lying flat in the glass nose of a heavy bomber, 4 miles above the earth, your oxygen mask fogging, your fingers clumsy in heavy gloves. Below and ahead, somewhere in the haze and the smoke and the bursting black flowers of anti-aircraft fire, is the target you have been briefed to hit. For the long minutes of the bombing run, the aircraft must fly straight and level, which means it cannot dodge, which means the flak gunners below have the easiest shot they will ever get at you. You hunch over the sight, the device you have sworn to destroy rather than surrender, and you try to find the target through the telescope amid the murk. You set your crosshairs, you turn the knobs to track it, you trust the spinning gyroscopes and the whirring gears to solve the impossible sum, while the aircraft shudders around you and men in the formation die. You are aware in some corner of your mind of the thermite charge fitted to the sight, the reminder that this brass instrument under your hands is considered more precious than you are, that if the aircraft goes down, your last duty is to set it alight so the enemy cannot have it, and at the calculated instant, the machine lets the bombs go, and they fall away into the 4 miles of air, carrying forward, drifting on the wind for the long seconds it takes them to reach the earth. You will likely never know exactly where they landed. Through the cloud and the smoke and the chaos, the pickle barrel of the legend is a fantasy. You did your part, you trusted the machine, and the bombs fell into the murk and the war went on. What, then, are we to make of Carl Norden and his masterpiece? It would be easy to call the whole thing a failure, but that would be unfair and untrue. The sight was a genuine marvel of engineering, one of the most sophisticated mechanical computing devices anyone had built in its time, and in the right conditions it did exactly what he designed it to do. The failure was not really in the machine, it was in the expectations heaped upon it, in the belief that a brilliant instrument could overcome the cloud and the flak, and the fear and the wind of real war and deliver a precision that the world simply would not allow. Norden built a beautiful answer to a problem of pure mathematics. War added 100 other problems his gears could not solve. He was a perfectionist who had built something very close to perfect, and then watched it be sent into conditions where perfection was impossible. The old man, secretive and exacting to the end, never sought the fame his device acquired, and perhaps that was just as well, because the legend that grew around it was always larger and cleaner than the messy truth. And the dream itself, the dream of true precision, of hitting exactly what you aim at from far away and sparing everything else, did not die. It simply had to wait for a technology Norden could not have built. His machine tried to solve the problem with gyroscopes and gears, calculating a release point and then trusting an unguided bomb to the wind and the long fall. The real solution, when it finally came decades later, was to guide the bomb itself, to give the falling weapon eyes and fins and a brain so that it could steer toward the target all the way down rather than being flung at a calculated point and abandoned to physics. The precision-guided weapons of the modern age are the true fulfillment of the dream the bombsight chased and could not quite reach. The thing Norden was reaching for was real and achievable and worth reaching for. He simply lived a generation too early, armed with brass and springs against a problem that would not yield until the electronics and the guidance systems of a later age arrived. The draftsman who stole the secret went to prison, his great betrayal having handed the enemy a thing the enemy did not want. The generals who guarded the site with oaths and pistols had protected a device that could not, in the end, do what they believed it could, and the bombardiers who swore to defend it with their lives carried it over Germany and dropped their bombs into the smoke and the cloud. hitting far less than the legend promised. The most secret machine of its age was, in the cold light of what actually happened, a brilliant invention betrayed by a quiet man, unwanted by the enemy who received it, and asked to perform a miracle that the chaos of war would never permit. They guarded it as if it could win the war by itself. The spy stole it as if it were worth a kingdom. The enemy looked at it and turned away, and over the burning cities of Europe, hunched in the freezing nose of a bomber, the men who actually used it learned the truth that all the secrecy had hidden. The hardest secret to keep was never the one in the blueprints. It was that the machine, for all its genius, was only a machine, and the war was so much larger than any machine could master.